Hey guys, JoINrbs here, and today we're looking at early game Shinobis in Long War II. In this series, I'm talking a lot about alpha strike ratings and breakdown ratings of soldiers, how good they are at killing enemies before they can attack you, how good they are at surviving situations where enemies are attacking you. And the Shinobi is a good breakdown soldier and, sort of okay at alpha striking in early game as well. In fact, quite good at alpha striking in early game. But Shinobis also have this very different strength, which is like being able to scout from stealth, being able to use officer abilities from stealth, potentially being able to play entire missions by themselves, depending on how you set things up. And those strengths aren't really going to be captured in my rating system for these perks or the class, so I'm going to try to talk about them a little bit. I also have to get through this in less than like 5 hours, so I'm going to try to be brief-ish. So at Squatty, Shinobis get Slash, Flesh, and Phantom, and all three of these are quite good abilities. Slash is, I think, the weakest. I gave Shinobis a 6 out of 10 for alpha striking, 9 out of 10 for breakdowns in the early game, and a 7 out of 10 for alpha striking on this like Squatty tier perk. Flesh lets you deal a lot of extra damage with your sword attack, so you can dash and attack, which is an increase in action economy, so that's cool. And it also gives you +1 damage for every 4 tiles distance between where you started the turn and where the enemy is standing. You don't have to worry about like running in zigzags or anything. That won't give you any extra damage. The game just looks at where you started your turn, not the attack, where you started your turn and where the enemy is standing, and adds more damage to your sword attack. And because you have this very linear, basic extra damage scaling on your sword attack, which, is meant to be relevant throughout the entire campaign, when you get it at Squatty, it's very, 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 very good. You can pretty easily create an extra +3 or 4 damage on an attack for yourself here, and 3 or 4 damage by itself would be a good attack for a lot of other soldiers in the campaign right now. So because of that, Shinobis become very, very, very good at alpha striking. They also gain bonus damage against sectoids. Melee attacks get bonus damage against sectoids, and sectoids have the most hit points in the campaign right now, and so they're very good at killing sectoids for you, which is nice because sectoids can also mind control your soldiers and do some other nasty things. The problem with Shinobis at Squatty and throughout the rest of the campaign really is that they have to be in melee range to attack, and that can be difficult to support. On early game guerrilla operations, I think one of the things that will really start to turn things up for you and make you start to crush missions that were difficult before is starting to recognize exactly when it's time to deploy your Shinobi. And I think that often it's going to be way earlier than you thought it might be. Shinobis regularly in missions use Phantom to stay in stealth and scout around for your squad, and then once things start to wind down, you're going to break stealth with the Shinobi and start killing things. But this soldier is dealing so much damage at this point in the campaign, and enemies are relatively non-threatening, and because of that, it's often correct to just start killing stuff with your Shinobi when you meet the first pod of a mission. And even if you pull another pod by going to melee range of that pod, you have to consider that you're up against a timer, and you have to consider that the pods you're pulling aren't that threatening. If you can get the Shinobi in heavy cover relative to them when the Shinobi makes the melee attack, it's probably going to be fine. And that the damage you're dealing with the Shinobi is very valuable. Few other soldiers at this point in the campaign can do this sort of damage without having to rely on some pretty expensive consumables or having to roll extremely well to get a crit or something like that. So the reason that Shinobis are only a 6 out of 10 for alpha striking early in the campaign is the awkwardness of working out exactly when to deploy them. But if you're doing extremely light guerrilla operations, it's usually pretty early, and they're usually going to make the mission much easier for you by just dealing lots and lots of damage. The Lance Corporal Shinobis pick between Ghostwalker, Lone Wolf, and Blade Master. And Ghostwalker is one of those abilities that's only really relevant for stealth. I gave it a slightly inflated Alpha Strike rating, maybe for its ability to make sure that you're scouting safely and find the first pod to kill it from stealth consistently. But in general, you're only picking this perk if you want to do stealth shenanigans with the Shinobi. And that's probably going to have to be the subject of an entirely different video or even entirely different entire series if we're going to talk about that. So I'll just leave it there. In 1.4, I don't usually pick any Ghostwalker Shinobis. I just don't think that stealth is important enough, and when I do stealth, it's usually done a different way from this. So generally, just leave Ghostwalker alone and don't worry about it would be my advice. Lone Wolf, I gave a 5 out of 10 for Alpha and a 6 out of 10 for Breakdown. I think Lone Wolf scales a little bit better than Blade Master, but it's a very awkward perk to use early in the game, and you only really care about the aim half of the perk early in the game as well. Enemies aren't attacking you for that much damage. It's difficult to position more than 7 tiles away from friendly squad members early in the campaign. So it's sort of an awkward perk to put together. As you get into mid and even approaching late game, you are able to set up situations where you have one sort of unkillable tank blocking a tile, preventing enemies from advancing against, say, 3 sharpshooters who are just mowing them down at squad sight range or something like that. And in those situations, the 10 defense from Lone Wolf can be very relevant. But early in the game, all you really care about is the plus 10 aim. And while it's awkward to get your defense going, the plus 10 aim's pretty easy to put together because of how your attack works. Shinobis can dash and attack with their sword. They can also blue move and then yellow move and attack with their sword. And because the sword attack cares where you started the turn, not where you actually started the attack from, and your roll to hit happens from where you start the attack rather than where you end, if you have, say, 2 soldiers standing next to an enemy, and you want to flush it with a Shinobi, what you can do is you can run the Shinobi away 8 tiles and then run back again, and you'll actually get the Lone Wolf bonus on the attack. You can set up your Shinobi behind your soldiers and run past them for a turn, get the Lone Wolf bonus from being behind them. You can deploy the Shinobi on your flank and run out from the flank and then back in to get your Lone Wolf bonus. And you can just deploy the Shinobi in the regular line with your soldiers, run forward 7 tiles, and then run the rest of the way to finish the attack, and again, get your Lone Wolf bonus. So there are lots of ways to get that 10 aim, and if you want a perk that probably scales a little bit better than Blade Master, you can consider Lone Wolf as a way to turn your Shinobi into more of a tank. But in general, I'm just taking Blade Master at Lance Corporal, and it's a lot less hassle to think about, so I'd recommend it. Give it a 7 out of 10 for Alpha, 9 out of 10 for Breakdowns, plus 1 extra damage on your sword attacks is regularly going to increase your chance to kill an enemy outright by something like 30%. It can be a very big deal. And plus 10 aim is also exactly what the Shinobi wants. The sword has a base bonus to aim on it already, and so you're often looking at 80 to 90% chance to hit against most enemies at this point in the campaign, and then when you take Blade Master, all of a sudden it's 90 to 100, and that's much safer. You're often happy to guarantee a graze on your sword attack as well, just because you deal so much damage with it, and so being able to guarantee a graze so commonly is really nice. And then once you're at 90%, often the risk is insignificant enough that you can feel pretty happy about deploying the Shinobi with the attack. And if the risk is a big deal, you do have hollow targeting on Sharpshooters to get up to 100% from there. So it is an option that you might want to think about. At Corporal, we have Shadowstep. Shadowstep makes the soldier not trigger Overwatch or reaction fire, and that might sound like it has some use in combat, but in practice it's pretty lackluster. There are lots of ways to deal with Overwatch or reaction fire. Lightning reflexes would be the best, probably, but you also just have flashbangs, area suppression. You can path your soldiers in ways where the enemies can't see them. You can path your soldiers so that they get shot at by the Overwatch fire, but they're in cover relative to it, and if you just do that with the soldier with ablative armor, they're probably not taking any relevant damage at this stage of the campaign where enemies just don't shoot very hard. So spending an entire perk to make this soldier not trigger Overwatch or reaction fire does not really appeal super much. Even if you're in a situation where lots of enemies are on Overwatch, why does this do anything exactly? How does it enable the rest of your soldiers to kill the enemies? And getting the Shinobi able to run through the Overwatches to do something, what does it do? Like, are you going to, against 3 enemies on Overwatch, are you going to run the Shinobi into the middle of the enemy team and attack one of them? How are the rest of your soldiers going to get forward to support that with the other 2 enemies still on Overwatch? So Shadowstep is just a very awkward perk. It's more relevant to like a stealthy Shinobi, but even there it comes up very seldom that Shadowstep will matter for a stealthy Shinobi. So you can just pass on this, in my opinion. I've taken it before on Shinobis I really didn't think would ever see combat ever, but in 1.4 those Shinobis don't have a huge place in the game. Executioner, I gave 4 out of 10 for alpha, 5 out of 10 for breakdowns, plus 10 aim, plus 10 crit chance against targets at half or less their original hit points. The biggest problem with this perk at Corporal is that there isn't anything that you need it against. So you can like already graze for 3 or 4 damage pretty regularly, which means that anything with less than 7 hit points you just actually don't need Executioner against, because anytime it procs you were already killing the enemy guaranteed. Against Mutons you probably don't want to attack with a Shinobi because Mutons can counterattack. You'd have to set up like a flashbang on the Muton and stuff like that, and once you're getting multiple actions against a Muton, you can like sort of stop worrying about exactly how you're going to deal with it. And plus you have to get the Muton down to 6 out of 12 hit points somehow anyway, which is work in and of itself. And yeah, they're just, Executioner doesn't do much. That's the thing. It's a nice perk to have on Rangers and some of the other shooty classes out of the AWC, because those classes are so good at picking their targets, and because other soldiers are in charge of like supporting their damage, and so you can like clear the cover of an enemy and put it at half health, and then the ranger can finish it off after like the rocket hits it or something like that. But that's just not really the role of the Shinobi in combat, and so Executioner doesn't do that much. And also the Shinobi often isn't really wanting to be in combat, so that makes a perk which only applies to attacks the Shinobi makes even less appealing. Combatives is my usual pick at Corporal, even though I only gave it a 1 out of 10 for alpha and 6 out of 10 for breakdowns. It lets you parry attacks and counterattack with your melee weapon, and you gain plus 10 dodge. So the plus 10 dodge is actually very relevant. That will come up a lot and reduce incoming fire against you by a significant amount. And then the parry on melee attacks, my understanding of how it works is that if a melee attack misses, or if it misses or grazes you, is how I should say that, you will counterattack it. And Combatives gives you plus 90 bonus dodge, which is hidden against the first melee attack made against you each turn. So the big problem with Combatives is if an enemy crits you, that will actually promote a graze to a regular hit. So if you dodge but they crit, it cancels out and you still get hit through Combatives. Throw a nanoscale vest onto your Shinobi to reduce crit against the Shinobi by 25%, or get resilience out of the AWC, and you're pretty much set. And Combatives is going to make you immune to the first melee attack of each turn, more or less. And sometimes you'll also counterattack, multiple other melee attacks in a turn. Combatives can be very, very nice. It's a sort of perk which doesn't do things most of the time. The 10 dodge is always there, but you don't really notice it. But then when Combatives does do things, it feels 1000% unfair. It's a sort of perk which can be a 10 out of 10 breakdown perk in the right breakdown. If you park your Shinobi next to a Muton, all of a sudden the Muton's just going to melee attack you every turn and fail to do anything while you hit it in the face. You can do the same thing against a Muton Berserker, in fact. If your Shinobi has somehow manage to become the target of a stun lancer, you don't have to worry about that. Stun lancers target sort of weirdly. There are a lot of little tricks you have to learn in exploiting AI trees to really make the most out of combatives. And if you get good at that, you can really push it even further. But even if you don't know this stuff, some of it's pretty obvious. Like if zombies are walking at your shinobi with combatives, you don't have to worry at all about the first one, for example. Things like that. At Sergeant, we pick between Covert, Hard Target, and Cutthroat. Covert makes enemies have 25% smaller detection range against you. I gave this a 3 out of 10 for alpha, 1 out of 10 for breakdowns. The reason Ghostwalker and Covert both have some alpha rating, even though they're like sort of strictly stealth perks, is that having a more reliable scout to set up like attacks against pods for you is valuable. And Covert's a reasonable perk to pick up at Sergeant on a Shinobi, even if you're going to be deploying the Shinobi to combat, in my opinion. I don't think that that's unreasonable at all. I have regularly done it. I know I rated it very low, but that's because my rating system sucks at evaluating this perk, basically. Its value is in keeping you in stealth longer, which just has all sorts of great effects on a mission where you're like deploying with sharpshooters or something like that. And it's also obviously useful on stealth missions where the shinobi is just trying to complete the objective with like maybe one other soldier. Hard Target, I gave 1 out of 10 for alpha, 7 out of 10 for breakdowns. Gains you 5 dodge per enemy. You can see up to a maximum of 30. Note the combo with combatives here. If you're getting multiple melee attacks against you and you have combatives, this is going to help you dodge more of them, which means that you'll be parrying far more of them, which can be a big deal, especially if you upgrade your sword to something which has a status effect on it and start stunning or burning enemies. Hard Target is, I think, the clear scaling perk at this tier. Well, maybe Covert. Covert and Hard Target are the 2 perks which scale very well at this tier. And then Cutthroat lets you bypass armor on biological enemies, and you get an extra crit chance and more bonus crit damage. So if you want to be able to kill enemies outright with your sword attacks into mid-game, Cutthroat is probably the perk for you. I gave it 5 out of 10 for alpha, 5 out of 10 for breakdowns. It's nowhere near as reliable as what Blade Master does, right? Like you're going from a shinobi who at Lance Corporal could basically kill any enemy you'd see 100% of the time by running at it and stabbing it, to at Sergeant, you're now like needing to pick your enemies. You have to pick the biological enemies instead of the mechanical enemies, and you have to crit them to really get a lot of bonus, and it doesn't do as much against enemies who aren't armored. So there are lots of reasons that this isn't quite as exciting as the alpha striking perks were earlier on, but sure, it's like fine. It gets you some damage. I would typically pick between Covert and Hard Target here. I like Hard Target a lot on a shinobi who I think is just going to be sort of a stationary tank for me. I often don't value concealment anywhere near as highly as some other players do. Even like Legend Iron Man players, some of them value concealment a lot more highly than I do. I couldn't tell you exactly why. I've spent a lot of time reading up on exactly how pods patrol around the map, so a lot of the time I sort of know where stuff can be. I don't know if that contributes. I've always felt very comfortable like pulling enemy pods at awkward times and just using heavy cover and stuff to defend against them, so I don't know if that contributes. I mind control robots a lot. I don't know if that matters, but like on my Golden Path missions in my last campaign, I was just running drones around to scout for me basically, and it doesn't matter if you pull pods because you shoot them with sharpshooters and your shinobi just sort of stands around doing nothing, was my experience in that late game. So yeah, I typically value Hard Target over Covert. And at this point in the campaign, my shinobi is transferring into a soldier who basically doesn't worry too much about attacking things. I'm going to train officer perks on them. At Sergeant, you're able to train Trial by Fire on an officer, which auto-promotes every soldier on the mission who's below the rank of Sergeant if you successfully complete the mission. So often in my campaigns, I'm trying to level shinobis super quickly, sending them on as many missions as I can, using them for their sword attacks to ensure the mission goes smoothly, and then getting them to sergeant and training them up as officers, and using them to level up the rest of my barracks who may be lagging behind. And yeah, I don't know. I like hard target here. I like hard target there. I've never been very interested in Cutthroat. I don't really want to run at enemies unless I'm confident that I'm going to kill them, because if I'm in a situation where enemies may be alive, I can just stand my soldier in heavy cover and play defensively, and that seems to work out pretty well for me. So I'd rather, generally speaking, roll the dice by playing defensively than aggressively in mid and late games of Long War II in its current state. And hard target makes me a little bit better at doing that. Anyway, that's the start of my Shinobi tree. I actually build Shinobis pretty similarly, regardless of their stats. Shinobis basically always, for me, like, kill stuff very early in the game, become officers who can be like secondary damage dealers in the early mid game, and then in mid to late game they're basically just officers, which means they're like full up on officer perks. They have concealment to scout for me, and they have tanking perks, and so no matter what their stats are, they pretty much all just stand by a tree and like command somebody to do something, or dodge some incoming fire, or stab a muton in the eye when it attacks them. And so yeah, my build is going to be pretty straightforward, and it's going to be justified largely by what I'm doing with Shinobis in the more macro sense. The other perks on this tree are, generally speaking, pretty pickable though. I think building Shinobis for damage actually works decently on like extremely light guerrilla operations throughout the entire campaign. The problem is I don't think it's very good at all on like HQ assaults or Golden Path missions or invasions. The really tough missions of the campaign, I don't want a damaged Shinobi at all. And so this is the soldier that I want on those missions, so that's what I'm building toward, and I have not yet had much trouble with extremely light missions, and when I do, there are other classes who are just better at them than damage dealing Shinobis as you get into mid and late game. So this is sort of a soldier who's so strong early that I really want to level them up, but then sort of becomes very awkward to maximize as a combat soldier in mid and late game, and so gets refocused toward officer perks and scouting and tanking for me. And I'm pleased with how they work out, and that's what they do. I'll see you next time, and we'll talk about what they're up to in mid game. Looking forward to it. Bye, guys.